Hello and welcome to today's Korea briefing. Today we'll be discussing what happened in Korea on Thursday, March 2025. Last night was pretty significant, actually. There were developments in a few really crucial areas. So we're going to be taking a deep dive into the Constitutional Court's decision to schedule a verdict for the Prime Minister's impeachment trial,
Yeah.
the latest in the investigations surrounding President Yoon's potential arrest, and this remarkable agreement that was reached on national pension reform, all of the stuff that we'll be unpacking, it all unfolded just last night.
Yeah, that's right. A lot of movement on multiple fronts here in Korea. And for those of you following along at home, understanding how these different events relate to each other is vital. It gives you perspective on the current state of affairs.
Okay, let's start with the Constitutional Court and the impeachment matters.
Oh,
Just last night, we learned that the court set Monday, March 24th at 10 a.m. as the date for the verdict in Prime Minister Han Duck-Soo's impeachment trial. This is 87 days after the impeachment was initiated.
87 days. That's a pretty long time for deliberation. And I think, as you pointed out, this is especially significant because the verdict for President Yoon Seok-Yeol is expected soon after, likely in the latter half of the following week. The Prime Minister's case shares some very important points of contention with the President's case, most notably the declaration of martial law.
Exactly as our sources detailed last night. The National Assembly had a number of reasons why they impeached Prime Minister Han. They included that he allegedly condoned President Yoon's declaration of martial law and that he refused to appoint Constitutional Court justices that were nominated by the legislature. Additionally, he was also accused of attempting to establish an extra-constitutional joint governance system. He didn't request the appointment of a special prosecutor to investigate the martial law declaration, and he even chaired cabinet meetings where the president's veto of special prosecutor bills were decided. So this really paints a picture of a lot of friction between the executive and legislative branches.
Yeah, it definitely does. And it highlights those huge political divisions that have been going on. For our listeners at home to really grasp this idea of the extra-constitutional joint governance system. Think of it like this. The Prime Minister was essentially trying to set up a power structure outside of the normal legal framework that could potentially undermine things like the separation of powers or just the established roles within the government. This would raise very serious questions about the legitimacy and legality of those arrangements. It's also important to remember that the Prime Minister has defended himself. He's argued that he actually opposed the martial law and that he wasn't involved in any troop deployments, and ultimately that the National Assembly's reasons for impeaching him were invalid. So this difference in perspective is really what the Constitutional Court is trying to decide.
And this is where it gets really interesting. The outcome of the Prime Minister's impeachment trial could tell us a lot about which way the president's own impeachment trial will go, because the legality of the martial law declaration is a key issue in both cases. The court's ruling on the Prime Minister could signal how they'll approach the president's case.
That's a really good point. If they decide that the Prime Minister's actions related to the martial law declaration were grounds for impeachment, then it could suggest that they might take a similar stance with the president. But on the other hand, if they reject the Prime Minister's impeachment, it could imply that it's harder to impeach a high-ranking official for these reasons.
You know what's really important for our listeners to consider here is that how the Constitutional Court interprets the Prime Minister's role in advising on or condoning the martial law declaration could set a legal precedent about the executive's authority in times of crisis. That could have a direct impact on how they view the president's actions, and it could potentially narrow or broaden what constitutes impeachable conduct in these situations. And there's another really important layer to all of this. The court will also rule on whether the National Assembly's vote to impeach the acting president was even lawful in the first place. Remember, Prime Minister Han was acting president at the time. This all comes down to how they calculated the majority needed for impeachment. Did they base it on his role as prime minister, which has a lower threshold? Or did they use the higher threshold that's usually required to impeach a president? This ruling will have big implications for any future impeachments against acting presidents.
Absolutely. The procedural parts of impeachment are just as important as the allegations themselves. If the court rules one way on this majority issue, it could set a precedent for future situations, times when the president's powers are being exercised by someone else. And this could actually change the balance of power between the legislative and executive branches in those cases.
Now let's move on to the investigations surrounding President Yoon Seok-Yeol's potential arrest. This also had some big developments last night. We found out that the warrant hearing for Kim Song-hoon, the deputy chief of the Presidential Security Service, and Lee Kwang-woo, the head of the security headquarters, took place yesterday. They could potentially be detained, and this is all linked to allegations that they obstructed the investigation into the president.
What's really interesting here is that these two individuals are accused of hindering the police
Hmm.
and the Corruption Investigation Office for High-Ranking Officials, CIO. That's the agency that's supposed to investigate corruption by top officials. They were trying to stop them from arresting President Yoon. The reports from last night seem to point to a real effort to stop the investigation from moving forward.
Right, and the allegations go even further than just that initial obstruction. There are also claims of GALO, which means unfair personnel actions, against security officials who apparently didn't follow orders to obstruct the arrest. And this is potentially the most serious part. There are allegations that they ordered the deletion of secure phone records. That could really damage the investigation.
Yeah, deleting potential evidence is a very serious accusation. It shows how far some people may have gone to stop the investigation. This is the first time that the court is actually considering detention warrants for both Kim Song-hoon and Lee Kwang-woo. Remember, the prosecution rejected requests for their arrest warrants before, 3 times for Kim and twice for Lee.
But our sources said last night that something changed. The Seoul High Prosecutor's Office's Warrant Review Committee decided that the prosecution's request was actually valid. And this is what led to the court review yesterday. So after all those rejections, the fact that the court is now involved means this could be a much more serious stage of the investigation.
I agree. The Warrant Review Committee's decision implies that they found enough evidence to justify the court getting involved, even though the prosecution was hesitant before. Maybe there's new information, or they're interpreting the existing evidence differently now.
And the reports from last night about the arrest attempt are pretty dramatic. There are claims that during the arrest attempt, President Yoon asked security officials if they could just shoot, and the deputy chief apparently said yes. These are some serious allegations that showed just how tense the situation was.
They are, and they raise some big questions about how much resistance the authorities faced when they tried to arrest the president. It sounds like a very charged and potentially dangerous situation.
And to make things even more controversial, there are also claims that First Lady Kim Ki-yeon, he said after President Yoon was released, that there was no point in the security detail having guns if they couldn't stop this from happening. But it's important for our listeners to know that the presidential office has denied these claims. They say it's not true.
It's really important to acknowledge both the allegations and the denials. These kinds of claims, whether they're true or not, they become part of the story and can really affect how the public sees things.
And finally on this topic, the police have said that releasing the president actually makes it more likely that evidence will be tampered with, especially those secure phone servers. This is a big part of why they want those security officials detained.
I understand their concern. It's really important to protect any potential evidence in an investigation. And the police are saying that if the president stays free, it could be harder to ensure that the evidence isn't tampered with, particularly digital records. They can be changed or deleted pretty easily. So we'll have to see what the court decides about detaining those security officials and what that means for the whole investigation into the president.
Now let's switch gears a little. Last night there was some news with really big implications for the future of South Korea. After 18 years of discussions and a lot of debate, the ruling and opposition parties finally agreed on national pension reform. This is a big deal that will affect pretty much everyone in South Korea.
Absolutely. Reaching an agreement on something this sensitive and complicated after so long is really impressive. The main idea behind this reform is paying more and receiving more. It's a pretty big change to how the national pension system works.
So to explain that a little more, the contribution rate, or Okorin, that's the percentage of income that people and their employers pay into the pension fund. It's going to go up from 9% to 13% over the next 8 years. It will increase gradually starting next year with a 0.5% increase each year. And what's crazy is this is the first time the contribution rate has gone up in 28 years. That really shows how long this has been a problem.
28 years is a really long time. And this increase shows that people are finally realizing how important it is to make sure the National Pension Fund has enough money, especially with people living longer and fewer babies being born. At the same time, the income replacement rate, or Shonu, that's how much of your income you get back as a pension after you retire, that's also going up. The plan was to raise it to 40%, but the agreement last night pushed it up to 43%. And this will also start next year.
The government has made some projections about what this could mean for the pension fund. They estimate that if they can increase the fund's investment returns by just 1%, they could delay the date when the fund runs out of money by 15 years to 2071. That's a huge improvement. Before this, it was projected to run out in 2055. And without these reforms, it would have started losing money in 2041. So this agreement is giving the system some much-needed breathing room. Imagine the pension fund like a bank account. For years, we've been taking out more money than we've been putting in, which is why it was going to be empty by 2055. But this reform is like increasing how much we deposit and trying to get better interest rates, which buys us more time and pushes that empty date further away.
That 15-year delay is really significant. It shows how big of an impact increasing contributions and investing better can have. Even small changes in these areas can really help the system.
The reform also expands the credit systems. The childbirth credit used to only apply to the second child and beyond. Now it will include the first child and provide 12 months of contribution coverage. The credit for military service is also going up to a maximum of 12 months. It used to be only 6. These changes show that people are recognizing the contributions that come with raising children and serving in the military.
These expansions are great. It's a step towards a more fair system. It recognizes that things like childcare and military service can affect how much someone can contribute to the pension fund during their working life. By giving these credits, it tries to balance things out.
And another really important part of this agreement is that it guarantees that the state will be responsible for making sure pension payments are stable. This is called kanon in Korean. It also increases support for low-income people to help them contribute. This is supposed to make people feel more secure about the system and make sure that vulnerable people aren't left behind.
Putting that state guarantee in writing is so important. It helps people trust that the system will be there for them in the long run. And helping low-income contributors is crucial. It encourages more people to participate and helps prevent them from falling into poverty after they retire.
So overall, the estimated date when the fund will run out of money has been pushed back to 2064. That's 9 years later than the previous estimate of 2055. This is all thanks to these new reforms.
That 9-year extension gives us some time. But it's important for listeners to understand that it doesn't completely solve the problem. It's a great step forward. But we'll probably need more reforms in the future to keep the system going.
To give you an idea of what this means for individuals, our sources gave an example. A worker making an average of 3.09 million won a month would end up paying about 50 million won more into the pension fund over their lifetime with this new system. But they would also get about 20 million won more in benefits when they retire. Their monthly contributions would go up by about 124,000 won, and they'd pay half of that increase. Their initial monthly pension payment is expected to increase by around 90,000 won, so it's basically a trade-off. You pay more while you're working, so you get more when you retire.
This example really shows what paying more, receiving more means in real life. It helps people understand how these changes will affect their own contributions and future income.
Of course, there are still some criticisms. Some people are worried that the fund could still run out of money, and others are concerned about whether older people will have enough money to live on. But both political parties are calling this agreement a crucial first step in solving this huge problem. They see it as a foundation for more reforms in the future.
That's the key point. This agreement isn't the final solution. It's a big milestone in a long process. It shows that everyone agrees we need to take action, even though we'll need more discussions and maybe even bigger changes down the road.
And those discussions are already starting. The National Assembly is going to create a special committee to look at bigger changes to the pension system. They'll be looking at things like combining the 4 main public pension funds, which is a really complicated thing to do. One of the key things they'll need to decide is whether to create an automatic adjustment mechanism. This would automatically adjust contribution rates, income replacement rates, and maybe even the retirement age based on things like population changes in the economy. This could be a really powerful tool for making sure the system stays stable, but it's going to be a tough decision to make.
Creating an automatic adjustment mechanism would be huge. It would take some of the politics out of future pension reforms. By linking things like contribution rates to objective factors, it could help the system last longer and be less affected by political pressures. But as you said, figuring out how that mechanism would work and what would trigger the adjustments is going to be a long and difficult process.
So to recap the biggest news from last night, the Constitutional Court set the date for the Prime Minister's impeachment trial next Monday. There was a warrant hearing for the security officials involved in the president's potential arrest, and there was a huge agreement on national pension reform.
And it's important to remember how these things might be connected. The outcome of the Prime Minister's trial, especially about the martial law declaration, could really affect what happens in the president's case. And the national pension reform will have a big impact on South Korea's economy and society for many years.
That's a really good point. It all feels connected. So here's a final thought for our listeners. We've got these big legal battles happening at the top levels of government and these huge changes to a system that affects everyone. How do you think these events will shape South Korea's political landscape and its future in the coming months and years? What are the biggest things you'll be watching for as these stories unfold? It's definitely a time of big changes and potential turning points for South Korea.